بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to our reading of this great book of our Tariq, the Principles of Sufism, Qawa'id al-Tasawwuf by Sidi Ahmad Zarruq radiyallahu anhu. We begin on the bottom of page 27 for those who have the book or the PDF. Principle 36 inshallah. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. So Sidi Ahmad Zarruq, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. Principle 36. It is important to regulate a science by means of its principles. Remember, when he uses the word science, it's the word that we translate al-ulum al-shari'ah, the Islamic sciences. So when it comes to inside the body of Islam, we don't refer to them as subjects, we refer to them as sciences. I've said this before, but maybe it bears kind of just expanding on it just for a moment. Of course, when we use the word science in English, most people think of experimental sciences, biology, physics, that kind of thing, chemistry, etc. But the word ulum in Arabic is not just limited to that which you experience or that which you can experiment or that which you can observe, but rather to any body of knowledge that is linked to our belief system. So all of the Islamic subjects, we refer to them as Islamic sciences. So that's a correct usage or correct translation. Anyway, so he's saying that everything has to be based on its principles. Continuing with the text, because they control its controversial points, explain its meanings, make known its forms, refute errors arising from its misinterpretation, guide whoever reflects upon it, assist the one who is mindful of it, support the proof of the legal disputant, when there's a debate between two schools, for example, make the way clear for the seeker, distinguish the truth for its followers, and separate it from error wherever it is. So that's why each of the Islamic sciences has what we call its first principles. Those are the principles that guide that subject, that science. And when you're lost, you go back to the first principles. If there's a debate, you go back to the first principles. If something is not clear, you go back to the first principles, because the first principles are established so that they're kind of like your guide, so you don't get lost on your way to learning. You don't want to get lost in the sea of multiple opinions. To extract those, continue with the text, to extract those principles from the branches of a science through investigation is possible for the one who wants to know them. However, shallowness of understanding is an obstacle in the way. This is why later generations, not the earlier ones, were concerned with the branches. But God, glory be to Him, knows best. What comes first, the principles or the branches? The principles are supposed to come first. And from the principles, you extract all of these branches. Now, can you look at a bunch of branches and go backwards and extrapolate and get to the principle? Yeah, you can, obviously, because they're connected, but it's more difficult is what he's saying. What is one of the signs that it's more difficult is the latter generations. We are the Khalaf. We are after the 5th Islamic century, everything up until the year 500 plus or minus, we call that the time of the Salaf, and 500 of the Islamic calendar, and everything post 500 is the Khalaf. And you can always remember it by the death of Imam al-Ghazali, who died in 505 of the Hijrah. Just a kind of easy number to remember. Imam al-Ghazali, 505, he's the last of, amongst his generation, they're the last of the Salaf. Anyway, the latter people, he's saying they're more concerned with all of the branches. Why? Because it's harder. It's easier to look at the branches than it is to do the deep work, to extrapolate or to isolate or to articulate the principles. So, and we find that today in our community. When we find Muslims debating, very small things, the number of rak'ats of Taraweeh prayer, or, the debates that you find between like Sunnis and Shias, the commoners, that is, not amongst the ulama. These they're very little things. They're small stuff when you think about it. They're not really substantial debates based on principles, because it's easier to get caught up in the sea of all of these like small things and not the principles. But as people of the tariq, we want to be concerned with the principles, inshallah, which is why we have this book. Okay, principle 37. If the origin of a science has been verified, if its substantive contents are known, if its branches are everywhere recognized, and if its principles are apparent, then the comprehension of it is widespread amongst its followers. So this is why some madhabs in any science spread and why some madhabs don't. This is one of the reasons why. A madhab that is well organized, that has its principles laid down, kind of what we're trying to do for our tariqah, for example. Hopefully, inshallah, this helps. It tends to make this way easier for people. But if something is kind of elusive and there's not that much work has been done, we can't really find all of the books about it, chances are it won't have longevity. Not always, but chances are it won't have longevity. With respect to this science, he who belongs to an earlier generation is not more worthy than he who belongs to a later one, even though the former has the merit of precedence. Thus the science is the decisive factor. So, if we have an organized way, whether it's tasawwuf or fiqh or usul or aqid, whatever the science is, it doesn't matter, or philosophy, and the principles are clear, and we all understand the principles and we're serving those principles and dealing with those principles, then it doesn't matter if you're from the earlier generation or the later generation, in the sense that each has an equal opportunity to advance the field and to do something positive in the field. The only difference is that the older people are older and we respect them because they came before us. It's just a function of time. The investigation of the latter scholars is more perfect because it is an increase over the knowledge of the earlier scholar. God's inspiration is hoped for by each one. So, one of the advantages of being later is that you have more precedence. So you have more to look back on and more to take into consideration. And more permutations that have been thought of. So don't feel bad that you're from the latter generation, as he's saying. You have an advantage. What an excellent man was Ibn Malik, rahimahullah, when he said, since the sciences are divine favors and special gifts, it is not too far-fetched to say that what was difficult for the earlier scholars has been stored up for some of the later ones. We seek refuge in God from any envy, which closes the door of justice, and is a block to beautiful qualities. It is a wonderful remark. Meaning that there's always good in the people of the followers of the Prophet ﷺ. The good could be at the end or the good can be in the beginning. So even though we are from the latter generation, it doesn't exclude us from doing great things or achieving great things, either from an academic and scholarly point of view or from a spiritual point of view. Okay, principle 38. Religious scholars are to be given credence with regard to what they transmit, because it was entrusted to their safekeeping and was the object of investigation in whatever they held to be true, and because it was the fruit of their intelligence. But infallibility has not been ascribed to them. So discernment is necessary out of a desire for the truth and in order to verify what was said, but not for the purpose of contradicting the speaker or transmitter. So, we accept things that have come to us as sound transmission, but at the same time, we don't believe that anybody is infallible except for the prophets, alayhim as-salam. So therefore, we have a discernment. We critique that which has arrived at us, which gives us this odd thing where we can accept something but not act on it. And that's for many people in the modern world that are black or white, that's very difficult for them to understand. How can you accept like a sound hadith, for example, but not act on it? Well, because transmitting it is one thing and understanding it and acting on it is something else altogether. Continuing with the text. Accordingly, if the scholar of a latter generation holds to a teaching not held by anyone before him, he is to be judged in accordance with his rank. Nor must he feel obliged to belittle the scholar of an earlier generation or to treat him with uncivil manners. So, هذا مبلغ علم الشافعي, we say, this is the extent of what Imam al-Shafi'i knew. Or هذا مبلغ علم عمر, this was the extent of what Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu was able to know. So we don't disparage them. We just say that's what they did. And on this issue, given the current context, I have a slightly different take because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is the extent of my knowledge, and so on and so forth. So we can receive from the past, slightly diverge from the past, or even critique the past without disparaging the past. 4. The justice that has been affirmed to exist in an earlier scholar decrees that he should return to the truth when it is expounded. Were he to hear it, it would be binding on him. If it were to lead to the refutation of his teaching because of the reality, not the probability of the truth, for probability has already been affirmed in the teaching of the earlier scholar. As a result of all of that, later religious leaders contradicted the earlier ones without any belittlement in either of the two camps, so understand. Okay, this is very important. Islam is an evolving body. Islamic law is a discursive tradition. It moves throughout time and place and people and circumstance. So if we follow an opinion today that might seem to contradict or go against an established position in a previous school of thought or in a previous generation, it doesn't mean that we are going against that school or we are going against that imam. But rather it is exactly for the reasons that we are following the methodology of those people that we are able to say, well, the circumstance of today has changed on this issue, so therefore we have to, the ruling manifests in a different way. So Muslims of the later generation like us, like he said, we can end up going against some of the opinions of the past without being disparaging of the past. It's not despite of the past. It's not in spite of the past that we have a different opinion, but it is our adherence to that methodology. Because what are we searching for? We're searching for the truth. And this is really a blessing when you think about it, because we have such a multiplicity of Islamic positions, especially when it comes to Islamic law. Okay, principle 39. The basis of religious knowledge is study and investigation, whereas the basis of a spiritual state is submission and belief. So when you ask a mufti a question or a faqih a question, their answer is going to be based on their study and their investigation of the sources. But when you ask a Sufi sheikh a question that relates to the path, their source is going to be their spiritual state and their belief. And this is where a lot of people, this is a very important principle because a lot of people will get this wrong. So he says, continuing with the text, if a Gnostic speaks about religious knowledge, his statements are examined in order to ascertain their sources in the book, meaning the Quran and the Sunnah, and the traditions of the pious ancestors. For religious knowledge is to be given due consideration by examining its principles. So if the Sufi sheikh gives you knowledge that is coming from the Sharia, then you have to base, those statements have to be based on the Quran and the Sunnah and the precedents of the past. It doesn't matter how pious the person is, or how spiritual the person is, or how saintly the person is. When the person speaks with the outward sciences, then their statements have to be in the scale of the Quran and the Sunnah. However, if he speaks from the point of view of a spiritual state, his intuition is to be considered sound. For no one can evaluate remarks made under such circumstances unless he is in a similar state. Thus his remarks are given their due because they result from his state of ecstasy. But when the Sufi sheikh speaks about spiritual matters, they are speaking about things that they have experienced, that they have witnessed, the veils that have been lifted for them. So therefore the scale is different, as long as that person is somebody that we trust. And that's how we can weigh the things that we read, like all of these saintly stories about very luminary and saintly figures in the history of Islamic tasawwuf. We might not understand them at face value. They might even seem jarring at times. They might even seem contradicting something from the outward sciences. But this is a trusted person, so therefore he can only speak, or she can only speak, in a way that is completely congruent with how they experienced what they experienced. So, continuing, he gives you an example. Our teacher said to a novice of his, so a sheikh is telling his disciple, "My son, cool the water. For when you drink cold water, you praise Allah Ta'ala with all your heart. But when you drink it hot, you praise Allah Ta'ala resentfully. So the disciple asked, Master, what about the man who finds that his jug is in the sun and says, I'm too embarrassed in front of Allah Ta'ala to move it just to satisfy my own needs? And he replied, my son, that man is in spiritual state of ecstasy and is not to be followed. So the Shaykh here is giving the murid a lesson. He said, I want you to drink cold water because you owe murid, you specifically, when you're going to drink the cold water, you're going to be in a state of gratitude for everything. But when you drink hot water, it's like he said, it's going to be difficult for you. So the student or the disciple is not listening, right? Like many murids, when we talk, sometimes they just don't want to listen. They keep pushing on their point. So he's like, well, how about this guy? He's going to move the water. He sees the water, it's hot. And you said don't drink the hot water. So I'm going to move it to be cool, but I'm doing it for a nafsi point of view. Right? I'm doing it for my nafs so that I can. So it's like I'm kind of doing it for a selfish reason, even though it's couched in a spiritual lesson. So the Shaykh is saying, the person who does that, if they're a person who's praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are beyond the confines of is the water cold or is the water hot. They're in a state of ecstasy. So in everything they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, you can't follow somebody like that because that's a hal. The hal, the spiritual state is given to you. And so I hope everyone understands the story. So the Shaykh is telling the student, okay, I'm going to give you a hack. I'm going to give you a little trick. When you drink water, make sure that it's cool. Because you're going to be always thankful. So I'm helping you, put you in a state of gratitude. Okay? And then the student notices that somebody else kind of artificially moves the water. So that, so he's saying, well, is he really praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or is he doing it for selfish reasons? So the Shaykh is saying about that murid, well, that murid, or that saintly person, he is in a state of ecstasy. And he's not going to move the water to a cool place to satisfy his own desire. He's going to drink the water as he finds it, no matter what, to always be in a state of praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the Shaykh is telling his murid, that person you can't follow because that's a spiritual state. That person has become elevated above worrying about if the water is cold or hot. It's not going to, whatever he finds, he says, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Okay, now, one of the reasons this principle is very important is because a lot of what we find in the works of tasawwuf are works in which the authors write for us and share with us their experiences. And the greatest example of this is Ibn Arabi, Shaykh al-Akbar radiallahu anhu, and Futuhat al-Makkiyah. The whole book are things that Shaykh al-Akbar experienced and Allah Ta'ala opened for him while he was visiting Mecca. So you can't say it's right or you can't say it's wrong because the man experienced these things and no one's going to say that we don't trust Ibn Arabi. I mean, Shaykh Ibn Arabi was like a mujtahid, he was a mujtahid. So he was in the outward sciences, he was of the highest caliber. He had his own legal opinions. Some of them are very unique. So in other words, we trust him. So if he says, in Mecca I saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm not going to deny that he saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, what does that mean? I don't know, because I didn't experience it. And that's why when you come to like an institution like Al-Azhar or like Al-Qarawiyyin or Zaytuna, the great, the schools of Baghdad, the Nizami, the great schools that we have inherited in the Muslim world, you don't find that those schools would use an author or a figure like Ibn Arabi in their manhaj as a curriculum, because it's not a book that you can teach. Rather, it's something that you can read when you're ready, and you can kind of emotionally and spiritually connect with what he saw. But it's not something that this is the manhaj, this is the way of Ibn Arabi. It's something that he experienced. And I'm just using that as an example. And there are many, many writers that are like that, many, many Sufi writers that are like that, where they will talk about the things that they have experienced. So when you come across something like that, don't negate it. especially if it's somebody who's like in our silsila, or it's somebody who all of the other ulama praise as a saintly person, because of this principle, that he is speaking or she is speaking from something that they experienced. But when that same person is talking about, Quran and Sunnah and fiqh and fatwa and stuff like that, there's only one scale for that, and that's the scale of the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay, I'm going to do two more because in my Arabic book, Principle 41 concludes section 3, so I'm just going to do two more really quickly. Today will be just a little bit longer, so I come to a good stopping point. Principle 40. Whatever is intelligible contains its proof in itself. As a result, it is not necessary to know who said a particular thing, except that it gives more credence. So if I say 1 plus 1 is 2, it doesn't matter if the person who said 1 plus 1 is 2 is a Muslim or a non-Muslim, a believer or a non-believer, because it's a rational truth that is inside itself. It's inherently true or false in itself. What is transmitted, however, manqul, that which is the transmitted sciences are these Sharia sciences, is entrusted to the safekeeping of the transmitter. It is thus necessary to investigate and define his methodology. So in Islam, when it comes to religious knowledge, we first have to ascertain who is the person giving us. Is the person giving us this piece of information reliable or not reliable? Then we critique that which is transmitted. So first is the transmitter, and then that which is transmitted. That which is a combination of intelligible and the traditional form is to be dealt with carefully, using both information and explanation. Ibn Sirin radiallahu anhu said, this discussion has to do with religion. Be sure of the person from whom you take your religion. A very famous statement by Ibn Sirin. If I'm not mistaken, this is found quoted in the collection of Sahih Muslim. But it's not a hadith, it's Ibn Sirin who said it. This detailed explanation is with regard to one who has mastered religious knowledge and is aware of its goals. As for the layman or the novice at the beginning of their studies, he must know the methodology to use to obtain both the intelligible content and the traditional form, so that he might emulate his teacher rather than follow them blindly. But God, glory be to Him, knows best. So, for us, it's very important that our teachers are people that are upright and reliable, because when you start to learn, you learn by imitating them, and then that imitation is the beginning and moves on to a deeper type of knowledge. So for us, when it comes to the deen, when it comes to religious stuff, it's very important that the person who is bringing us this piece of information is somebody that we can trust. And then he picks this up further in the next and the final principle we'll discuss for today, Principle 41. Blind imitation, taqlid, is the acceptance of a teaching without regard to the reputation of the teacher or to the methodology of the teaching. It is absolutely objectionable because the person of blind imitation is making a mockery of his religion. So taqlid is you follow what someone says without caring who the person is or what, I heard somebody say such and such, so I'm just going to follow it. Okay, that's the entry level stuff, and it's very, as he said, very dubious, because, you have no way of measuring if it's good or bad. Emulation, al-iqtida, is a little bit higher than that, is the acceptance of a teaching by taking into consideration the religiosity of the teacher and his knowledge. This is the method of the jurisconsults of the schools of jurisprudence in following the founders of their schools. Calling emulation blind imitation is figurative speech. So I follow the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i. So we call that taqlid. And he's saying, but to say taqlid in this context, that's just a figurative of speech. What you're doing is you are doing iqtida. You are emulating Imam al-Shafi'i because you trust Imam al-Shafi'i. Because Imam al-Shafi'i was a saintly person by consensus of all Muslims. There's no dispute into the saintly status of the four Sunni Imams, Imam Abi Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam al-Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. No one in the history of Islam is going to say other than those who are luminary people. You might not agree with some of their legal deductions, that's a scholarly thing. But as far as an upright person, they were upright people by consensus. And there are many others, but I'm just using this as an example. Okay, discernment, at-tabassur, is the acceptance of a teaching by virtue of its specific proof without being self-opinionated or disregarding the teaching at its face value. This is the method of the masters of the schools of law, schools of jurisprudence, and of the elite amongst the seekers of religious knowledge. So you accept it because you understand the specific proof behind it. So you've spent some time to investigate why this is important. Independent legal reasoning, ijtihad, which is the highest level of knowledge that we have in any science, is proposing rules based on proofs without reference to other authorities. Then, if no previous principle is to be considered as a precedent, the judgment is absolute, otherwise it is limited. A school of jurisprudence is that which grows stronger in a person's soul until he follows it. The general meaning of the above is mentioned in Miftah as-Sa'ada. So, these are the kind of the levels of knowledge and how we seek knowledge. And the same applies also for tasawwuf, because tasawwuf is a tariqah rather, is like a school, is a body of knowledge and a body of practice. And you first start the spiritual path by following the person who's giving you the dhikr and giving you the suluk and stuff like that to help you on your way until you get to a point where you are able to go and continue the path on your own. And with that we'll come to an end. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim tasliman kathira.